I'm Jonathan Aronson. I'm a professor here at the Annenberg School, and I would like to welcome you to this first colloquium of the new year at the Annenberg School. We're in an unusual room today because the journalism accreditation team is here, so they have taken our normal room. Before announcing our speakers for today, because it's been a little while, so we decided to have two speakers today, who I thought had worked together for a long time and discovered that while they had talked, they hadn't in fact met, so that this will be an exciting opportunity. I want to announce the two future sessions to get them on your calendar. On the 23rd of March, we will have Eva Arush from Dewey University, who's now visiting at Princeton, who will be speaking here. We do not have the exact topic yet, but stick it on your calendar. It will be back. And on the 31st of March, Byron Reeves from Stanford University will be joining us. So keep those dates open if you can. You will obviously hear from Jeff Baum much more in the future, so as the details all firm up. But today I'm pleased to welcome David Bollier and Robert Mcchesney, two of the more interesting writers working today in this realm on the topics of the politics of media, technology, and culture. David, who is a senior fellow at the Norman Lear Center, is going, and an activist author, is going to go first. We'll talk, I suspect, some from his recent book, Brand Names, a new book, really, isn't it?
2 weeks old.
2 weeks old. Brand Name Bullies, The Quest to Control Culture. So we'll get some vignettes, I suspect, from that. Robert Mcchesney, a well-known communication scholar at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, will be also involved, and we're going to see what, we're going to react a little back and forth and see how this works. I don't want to take any more time, so without further ado, I'm happy to introduce David Bollier.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I find myself in the unlikely position of taking a layman's tour of the forbidding precincts of intellectual property law. It's an area that has been too long the preserve of the professional mandarins and the lawyers. And as somebody who came out of the Washington activist policy world, I thought it deserved some focus and attention. I first came to learn about this when I went to a May 2000 conference that Yochai Benkler, the Yale law professor and brilliant theoretician of the Commons, convened. And there were about 50 intellectual property attorneys. And I was thunderstruck of what I learned about the expansions of intellectual property law, copyright, trademark law especially, and how it was expanding to take up the public domain. It was expanding, especially in the digital realms, to diminish fair use. It was eroding consumer rights as shrink wrap and click-through licenses were giving sellers vast new powers. And it was ultimately limiting creative expression, curbing democracy, and stopping all sorts of innovation and dialogue. So out of that revelation, to me, two colleagues, Gigi Sohn, a media activist who was then at the Ford Foundation, and Lori Racine, who was at the Center for the Public Domain, which is a foundation started by the Red Hat Linux vendor, we started Public Knowledge, which is an advocacy group in Washington, D.C., that deals with the public's rights in its many manifestations in intellectual property and the internet and other digital technologies. We work in much the same space as Electronic Frontier Foundation, but more in the policy, legislative end of things in Washington. EFF, of course, is in San Francisco. But as I got into this, I found that one of the biggest problems was how do you begin to talk about intellectual property to people who are not lawyers, don't care, don't understand? How do I tell my mother what is going on in a way that she could understand? And I came to realize, in part also because I worked for Norman Lear in his non-television life, that stories are an immensely powerful way to communicate something in its richer complexity. And so I did something that struck me any law professor might have done and should have done, which is communicate these arcane byways of intellectual property law in a way that the layperson might understand and perhaps care. And the more that I got into it, as someone with a smattering of legal training, I had attended a one-year program for journalists at Yale Law School. The more I got into it, the more I said, there's a rich mine of stories in the straight-up legal literature that deserve to be told to the layperson. And also, through my own reporting and work in getting public knowledge started, I realized there were a lot of other stories to be reported and brought together to supplement the case law in this area. So I brought them together in this book, brand named Bullies, The Quest to Own and Control Culture. And in some ways, this is a companion piece to my previous book called Silent Theft, which is about what I call the modern enclosure movement, which is the privatization and marketization of resources that we own in common. Biotech companies are patenting the human genome. Broadcasters are using the airwaves that we all own for free as basically a subsidy to commercial speech. Multinational companies are acquiring rights to fresh water, shipping it to the southern countries, and federally funded drug research being taken over by the drug companies, and on and on. Well, I found that intellectual property was another instance of the enclosure of the cultural commons, where things, resources, intangibles, images, sounds, and the rest that we took for granted as something we all have access to or should be able to share are suddenly not shareable. But just today I was in Beverly Hills. I walked past, I forget which hotel. There was a conceptual art, neon words that said, visual spaces are essentially can't be owned. I think that's what it said. And I thought it was a stunning phrase, because everything else is, I've discovered, trying to be owned, no matter how intangible. So let's get to the stories, because I found the stories are a way that you remember them, and they communicate in a certain emotional way, and it suggests that perhaps the law might not be the way, should not be the way it is. I had 4 categories of stories: arts and culture, the trademarking of public life, the role of copyright in stifling free speech and democratic dialogue, and then a whole section on absurd frontiers of control, where the actual case law and the straight-up law that the lawyers argue and the avant-garde spoofs that a number of artists are making sort of mingled together, and it's very hard to distinguish which is a joke and which is deadly serious. So I would just say before I start that there's a fundamental political question that these stories are all about. It's because it's about how do we assign property rights to information, creativity, and culture. Do free speech and culture really belong to all of us as a civic entitlement, or is it something that really only commercial entities ought to be able to have the ability to own, of course, while having a whole phalanx of lawyers to enforce those rights? Or sometimes they don't even have the rights, but those attorneys effectively, through their intimidation, allow them to arrogate them to themselves. Another starter I should stress at the outset is I'm not anti-copyright or anti-trademark. I think both bodies of law serve very important functions. And, but the problem is the balance that historically has been struck between them has not been, is seriously out of whack. And the triumph of property talk has eclipsed lots of public rights that historically have been there, such as fair use, the public domain, first sale doctrine, and other concepts like that. So property talk and property is often a very inappropriate metaphor for the intangible creations of a culture, because after all, a culture is about interdependence and sharing, not simple metering of usage through the market and permissions and payments. So let me get this. How do I start this? Okay. Oops. There's my... actually, I'll put that off for now. That's the book cover. I start my book out talking about a story that I found especially appalling, was that the ASCAP, the Performing Rights Society, which collects fees for the performance of music, in the mid-90s, went after several hundred summer camps that were using copyrighted songs like Puff the Magic Dragon and This Land Is Your Land. And they figured that they get a performance license for restaurants, jukeboxes, funeral homes, and so forth. Why shouldn't kids performing around the campfire be a performance right for which a fee should be charged? They approached the American Camping Association and tried to get fees ranging from, well, the average is about $1,200 per season for the right to sing copyrighted songs at summer camps. Because after all, summer camps sort of resemble resorts. So, resorts would have to pay for it. So why not these kids? The ASCAP COO was quoted in the press saying, "The camps buy paper twine glue for the crafts. They can pay for the music too." Well, when it was discovered that the Girl Scouts were among the other commercial camps, it was a huge firestorm in the press. ASCAP got totally singed in the public press, and they backed down. Although notably, they still retain their legal prerogative to charge a public performance license if they'd like to. And the lesson that I get from this, which shoots through many of my stories, is that creativity is in fact a social, collaborative, intergenerational phenomena as much as an individual one, something that the Ready to Share conference a couple of weeks ago here at the Lear Center was all about. But the problem is copyright says that copyright is chiefly an individual product alone. So you get some extreme collisions of the sort that occurred with ASCAP occurring. The ASCAP example also shows how much value is socially created value. Puff the Magic Dragon probably wouldn't have much commercial value if you didn't have one generation after another of campers singing it, keeping it alive. It would slip into obscurity if there was not this socially created value. And so therefore, why shouldn't that socially created public, the public that creates it, have some entitlements as well? We see this in the, I have to tell this story quickly about the rap and hip hop, because of course that genre got started on the promiscuous appropriation of sounds wherever they were. And it was a very vibrant new genre of artistic creation for precisely that reason. And indeed it was in the tradition of the blues. Muddy Waters, when he heard that Eric Clapton was using some of his riffs, said, "Well, if you're going to steal, steal with taste." and for them, they understood that the originality was in the performance, not in the composition per se. And who could perform like either of those two performers? So, he wasn't too concerned. And rap and hip hop had that same tradition. But now we've gotten to the point where sampling is illegal, even if it's an unrecognizable clip of a half a second. The circuit court declared last year that you have to have a license for the smallest type of sample, which essentially means that you have to be a rich artist in order to sample, and that the whole vitality, which was democratic and bottom-up, is starting to be cut off at the knees because of the overexpansion of the market in how creativity can occur. So not only that, while intellectual property is repressing creativity, it's really not entirely repressing it, it's pushing it underground. And that's why you have phenomena like the Grey Album, which was Danger Mouse mixed the Beatles' White Album and Jay-Z's Black Album, got the Grey Album. It was celebrated as one of the most best albums of the year by legitimate rock critics. And it just goes to show that creativity is going to happen. The question is, can you integrate it adequately with the market or not? Well, let me get to some images here. I talked a little bit about music. Painting and visual images are an example. This is an image by Barry Kite, who's an appropriationist artist. He took the Seurat's famous painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island La Grande Jetée from France, Impressionist, and he did Sunday Afternoon Looking for My Car. Now, he has dozens of these kinds of images, taking familiar images and giving them a modern twist. And he's gotten many cease and desist letters, and he's ignored them, and fortunately they haven't pursued them. They've considered him too much of a small fry. For example, the Bridgman Art Gallery in London went after him for doing the Sistine Bowl-Off, in which he had Michelangelo, people bowling balls like this. They're hilarious and not only amusing, but sometimes they make a trenchant political or cultural point. But his epiphany came when somebody ripped off one of his images. And he had his attorney said, well, should I send him a letter? And his attorney said, well, you can send him a letter, and then there'll be two of you paying attorneys. And the whole point was it's sort of a racket for the attorneys ultimately, or who's got the bigger army of attorneys to intimidate, because sometimes, usually, these things don't get litigated to the death, they get settled. To show how extensive this is, last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, there was an exhibit called the Illegal Art Exhibit, where Brewster Kahle, who's with the Internet Archive, and Carrie McLaren, who runs an anti-commercialization magazine called Stay Free, produced this exhibit of forbidden images. And I'm going to show you a forbidden image. This, of course, is Matt Groening's Binky the Rabbit punching out the Trix Rabbit, which I think is hilarious. This is from the zine, you can sort of read it, Bunny Hop. And Matt Groening, who arguably built his career on the masterful appropriation of other people's cultural imagery in The Simpsons and so forth. This was before The Simpsons, or it was in 1995. They sent a cease and desist to Noel Tolentino, the author of this image, and he was forced to destroy all the copies of this. In fact, when I asked Tolentino if I could have a copy, perhaps for legal reasons, he said, no, I can't supply you with one. This came from the website of the Illegal Art Exhibit. I don't know where they got it. I have a section in my book about Andy Warhol, and he's a singular artist for having to be able to navigate a lot of these issues, because he was of sufficient stature that he was actually able to get Disney to let him do a Mickey Mouse. And Disney and the Warhol estate own joint rights in Warhol's Mickey. But if you wanted to do Mickey otherwise, chances are you couldn't. You probably wouldn't be able to. Warhol had to deal with such things. He wanted to do Aunt Jemima for a series of images called American Myths, or the Myth series. And Quaker Oats refused to let him do Aunt Jemima. So he approached this jazz singer, Sylvia Williams, who was performing in the Village, and said to explain the situation. And she was outraged that any company would presume to own her black heritage of Mammy. And she agreed to pose for Warhol. And actually, he wanted initially to call it Aunt Jemima, but he called his image Mammy, and Sylvia Williams was the model for it. But it's an example of how a corporation can limit the circulation and flow of an image that is part of our heritage. Had Coca-Cola trademarked its famous Santa Claus image of the 30s, which is in some ways the archetype for the Santa Claus we know and love, we wouldn't be able to perhaps circulate it the way we do now, and something that's part of our folk culture would be owned by Coca-Cola. Another aspect of this, another visual image, is in this portion that I talk about trademarking of public life. And one of the preeminent brand name bullies is Mattel, because it's in the business of protecting the meaning of such things as Barbie. It doesn't just simply want to prevent consumer confusion. It wants to protect the singular meaning of her. So it has prevented a book called Adios Barbie, Young Women Write About Body Image and Identity, and it had to change the name to Body Outlaws because it was unacceptable for Barbie to be mentioned. Now, who knows if they went to court if that would hold up, but you know, a small publisher in Seattle, Seal Press, I believe it was, against Mattel, you know who's going to win that one in the litigation, or in the who can throw more lawyers at it. But Mattel has even gone after Adult Collectors magazine that features Barbie because it didn't like some of the news features, and they were saying they were using Barbie's images without authorization. An artist named Mark Napier did a series of photographs called Distorted Barbie, where he made a Down syndrome Barbie and an ugly Barbie and a fat Barbie, and that was shut down by Mattel. And then a few years ago, this a photographer named Tom Forsythe did this image called Enchilada Barbie, which is a series of 78 photographs of Barbie in the kitchen with food, in appliances, a blender, in sexual positions. And he spent about $5,000 making it, which is not very much. But even with that, he lost money. But when he also did some cards featuring this to circulate to try to get business for his thing. Mattel got wind of this. No nook or cranny of our cultural life can't be penetrated by the Disney or Mattel lawyers, and they found him and started to sue him. He went to the ACLU of Southern California. They said, we can't do an IP case, intellectual property case. So he found a law firm in San Francisco that agreed to represent him pro bono. The next few years, they spent a total of $1.6 million defending him. It went from the federal court to the circuit court. And last year, a major victory was achieved when at the circuit court level, and therefore it has more precedential value. They reprimanded Mattel for its groundless and unreasonable, quote, trademark dilution claim. Trademark dilution is this expansion of trademark law where previously trademark was simply to prevent consumer confusion or deception or fraud, a perfectly legitimate goal. But now trademark law is used to prevent dilution. It's a very poorly defined meaning, but essentially, if you use an image that's not authorized, this is diluting Barbie's image. So it's an attempt really at cultural control of meaning. Another example of this is Mickey Mouse. Now this was done by a group of hippie artists in the late 60s and early 70s called the Air Pirates. And as you can see, it's a vulgar version of Mickey Mouse. They scraped together about $1,000 to print this, and because they weren't initially noticed, they smuggled it into the Disney boardroom. They wanted to provoke Disney. And they quickly got their lawsuit. And eventually this found its way to the circuit court, where they ruled that the comics were not protected parodies. It was not a fair use because while it's okay to use a recognizable character quote, excessive copying precludes fair use. And essentially that means that they were too good. It was too good of a likeness because they took too much of Mickey Mouse to be permissible. This trend extends to, I have a section called the corporate privatization of words. And there's several examples of this. Of course, we had there's a famous example from history where Groucho Marx the Warner Brothers went after him because he wanted to name his movie A Night in Casablanca, which of course might be confused with Casablanca. And the Warner Brothers went after him, and he had this hilarious set of correspondence with the Warner Brothers attorneys making fun of them. And actually, I should probably read some of this because it's just too hilarious. He said that professionally, we were brothers long before you were, the Marx Brothers. He pointed out that even before the Marx Brothers, there were the Smith Brothers, the Brothers Karamazov, Detroit Tigers outfielder Dan Brothers, and Brother Can You Spare a Dime, which Marx asserted was originally plural, but this was spreading the dime pretty thin, so they threw out one brother. Marx asked Jack Warner if he was the first Jack, citing Jack the Ripper as a possible precursor. So this is when I read this, I said, what would Groucho say? Is sort of like, we need Groucho today for some of these stories because it's precisely that kind of response. And here's an example, DaveZilla.com. There's a Japanese company that owns the trademark to Godzilla, and they make a business of going after anybody who uses Zilla, and notified Dave, I've forgotten his last name, but the gentleman who runs this website. And another example in this vein of the corporate privatization of words is, of course, Al Franken, who said that he used fair and balanced. And allegedly, at the behest of Bill O'Reilly, Fox News claimed that it owned a trademark in fair and balanced, and that this was diluting, if not causing, consumer confusion, despite, of course, lies right across it all. So they were, with a straight face, arguing to the court that this fair and balanced representation was confusing consumers in the marketplace. Well, they were laughed out of court, fortunately, but they were lucky that the publisher, Dutton, was willing to hire Floyd Abrams to pursue the case for them and make a big stink. But of course, if you're not Al Franken, you're not likely to be able to perhaps prevail against Bill O'Reilly. A similar but lesser known story is the Dewey Decimal System. This was a cartoon making fun of portions of it, but of the let me look. The Online Consumer Library Center, the OCLC, owns the trademark in the phrase Dewey Decimal Classification System. They sent around cease and desist letters to many libraries saying, if you're going to use Dewey Decimal and use that in your library, you need to pay us a license to use that, because they claim that they update and refresh and renew the classification system over time. And again, the fact that the library system over decades, since I think it was the 1870s, had created this classification system and named it after its founder, Melville Dewey, didn't count for anything because they had bought the rights to the trademark. This obviously is, shall we say, chilling, has some chilling effects on public life. That is really another thing that we don't see very often, but copyright is used to, West Publishing claimed that they own the copyright in the page numbers of federal court cases. And that this is important because if you're a lawyer, you have to use the page numbers as citations. And so therefore, they had this perpetual monopoly on access to the law because nobody else could use their citations without violating their copyright. Fortunately, that was thrown out in the late 90s. However, they still remain the dominant provider because, of course, there are decades of dominance. How am I doing at time? 5 minutes? Okay. So that's the law. There was a case of a Texas building code that the trade association developed. The legislature passed it. The trade association claimed a copyright in the building code, and they actually prosecuted a man who put the code on his website because he figured, anybody should be able to see the building code. It's the law. He had to actually pursue this through litigation to the circuit court level before he was vindicated. So the building code law remains in the public domain. But it gives you an idea of how precarious our public access is to things that we thought belonged to all of us. Here's something that belongs to all of us. Whoops. The I Have a Dream speech. This is actually private property. It's owned by the estate of Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, and her four children. And they have gone after both companies and individuals for using the speech or the image without appropriate payment or permission. I find that personally odious, that something that we have a national holiday at is associated with is still considered private property. Meanwhile, the King estate has licensed the use of this speech to Alcatel and Singular for advertising campaigns. So it shows in sort of stark clarity, again, the collision of marketplace values and some really core civic and democratic values. Finally, I talk about intellectual property going over the top. And we have instances where, singing in the shower, if you could meter it in some way or enforce it adequately, would likely be considered private property and not usable. A more stunning example of this, which was pursued as a joke but was actually became part of the law, this is a certificate to a gentleman who's now a University of Iowa professor, Kembrew McLeod, who got the trademark on the expression freedom of expression. And it is actually his private property. He had a chance to vindicate his rights when AT&T developed a marketing plan called Freedom of Expression for college students. And he sent them a cease and desist letter and was promptly ignored. They didn't even send a reply. And of course, he had no legal resources to pursue a case against AT&T. But his point was made. The fact that my other favorite trademark story is that a gentleman with this spoof corporate inspiration merchandise company called Despair Inc. got a trademark on the frowny emoticon, and then had a press release in which he announced that he was going to sue the 7 million internet users who use the frowny emoticon, and he was going to use the FBI carnivore software program to track them all down. And then in a phrase that I found stunningly similar to Jack Valenti, he said, oh no, I'm not going to be able to find it quickly, but he basically said, and we don't care if you're the Time Man of the Year or a mama's boy, we're going to chase you down and make you have something to frowny emoticon about. But I found a number of stories in which these spoof artists would do things like that I, at first blush, would not be able to tell if it was really different than something a lawyer might be pursuing. Starbucks coffee. There was when Larry Lessig posted on his blog that two patrons in North Carolina had snapped snapshots of each other. They had come together after not seeing each other for many years. A manager rushed up to him and said, "You can't take pictures of each other in a Starbucks. This is," he didn't say trademark, he didn't fully explain it, but the supposition was, this is trade dress, the interior design, which of course is very carefully designed. Well, Larry posted this on his site, and within days got dozens of people saying, you know, I was in Hong Kong, that happened to me. I was in Texas, I was in, and it was an apparent corporate policy. Neither he nor I, when I contacted the Starbucks PR department, were able to verify this. In fact, they didn't get back to me after several inquiries. But the supposition is that they thought their trade dress ought to be protected, and that even casual photographs would violate their rights. I've got many more stories I could tell. They're fun to tell. They're good for a laugh, but they add up to a larger picture, which is there's a tighter lockdown on culture. This is achieved both through the law and through the technology itself, lots of encryption and digital rights management systems. The folk culture, the bottom-up culture, especially as that represented by the internet, is being privatized. Disney, of course, that's another story in itself. It's the empire, in many ways, built upon the back of folk stories and literary classics that arguably we created the value of the franchise on. There's broad trademark claims on words. There's attempts to own facts through database legislation. There's litigation to squelch parodies. There's broad protection for celebrity persona. I could go into that, how you can't call your portable toilet company Here's Johnny, because Johnny Carson's celebrity rights or persona rights are violated by that. You can't evoke Vanna White's image of letter turning through a female robot, because that violates her. She got $400,000 from Samsung for violating her celebrity rights. There's many enclosures of the public domain of facts, laws, news. There's claims to own letters, silence, smells, even yoga postures. The Bikram yoga is claiming copyright control over his sequence of yoga postures. So that's sort of a rough overview of all this. Bob Mcchesney is going to talk a little bit more about some of the reform efforts that are underway to deal with this. I consider the intellectual property aspect of it really one major manifestation of a phenomena that actually affects many other aspects of media policy and media concentration. So with that, thank you.
That was a terrific talk. And David, I can tell you right now, you're going to sell 300 copies of that book to me, because I'm going to use it in my undergraduate course in the fall, because it's very timely and extraordinarily important. And it illustrates really the significance, the central significance of policy making. Because all of this takes place because of policies. There's nothing free market about any of this. In fact, all that intellectual property law is an interference with free markets. It creates monopoly privileges to prevent there being competitive markets. And like David, I share the importance of copyright. It has a very important role. But the sort of what we see that he describes and what Larry Lessig has described is simply an outrage. And it owes, as I'm about to talk about, to extraordinarily corrupt policy-making process in this country. And if we right that process, issues like this will get the fair hearing they deserve, and we'll eventually have intellectual property laws and copyright laws that will reflect all our interests, not those of simply the media content holders. But before I start my talk, I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the Southern Cal faculty in general. I had a privilege of meeting a lot of you over the past few years, but especially this weekend. We've met and talked about a number of issues. And I want to thank my friend Larry Gross, who has really been central to getting me connected to Southern Cal since he's come out here, and I'm working closely with him on a lot of projects and looking forward to doing a lot more work in the years to come on all these issues. My work, some of you might be familiar with it, some of you might not be, but it has been centrally looking at a couple of things. The history of our media system and the institutional pressures that generate certain types of content and discourage certain other types of content, and how those are related to the structures of the industries. And then more importantly, the policy-making process that created those structures and how those policies were derived. That's been the historical work I've done primarily. And my argument and my work is I got someone's cell phone up here? Oh, I'm very low tech. I'm going to check sports scores if this talk bottoms out. Yeah. At any rate, my work has really looked closely at the policy fights historically in this country, how to determine our media system. And I think the premise of my work starts from now, and certainly the conclusion that comes from my research, is that it's inaccurate to think of our media system as a natural free market system. It's inaccurate to think of our system that we have today as being something that was ordained by the Founding Fathers, by Moses, by the Constitution, by any of that stuff, Adam Smith. Those people have nothing to do with what exists today in our media system. No relationship whatsoever. In fact, in my last book, The Problem of the Media, the first chapter of it, I did a detailed analysis of the founders and their understanding of freedom of the press and the policies they put in place to create a free press system in this country. Extraordinarily lavish postal subsidies to spawn a much richer print media than the market would have ever permitted. And it's clear that no one in the first 100 years of this country's history, not a single person, even could have conceived of the idea that freedom of the press means simply letting wealthy people make as much money as possible in media and letting the chips fall where they may. That was an absolutely unthinkable idea. Freedom of the press was a right all free people had in a self-governing society. It wasn't a right just for wealthy individuals to make money without government interference. Moreover, and even more strikingly, if you look at our largest media companies, without exception today, they're all premised and based upon enormous gifts of government monopoly licenses, subsidies, and privileges. There's not a free market player in the group. There's nothing free market about these guys. What are these privileges I'm talking about? Well, radio and TV licenses, the grant for free of monopoly privileges, of monopoly protection by the government to radio and TV slots. Cable franchises, monopoly franchises given by municipalities. That's very lucrative at a nominal expense, I dare say. Satellite system franchises. There's only so much spectrum for a couple satellite systems to serve this country. So you get one of those chunks, you're sitting very pretty. And then most importantly, the largest one of all that's rarely talked about, which is what David's work is about, copyright. I asked Larry last night, Larry, how much is copyright worth, these monopoly privileges that we give to these companies, these media companies? And he said, no one knows, because no one's calculated it. But what we do know is this. There's occasionally lawsuits that come out over copyright and the value. There's lawsuits between different parties who's got the copyright protection, where they estimate the amount. And lawsuits like it was the Milne estate for Winnie the Pooh. They had a famous lawsuit in the mid-'90s. This is just one small potatoes thing that Disney claimed they had copyrights for, and they're fighting whoever the Milne family had sold the rights to, because you can sell copyright privileges now. It doesn't connected to authors anymore. And they've calculated over $1 billion a year just the copyright value for Winnie the Pooh for Disney. Just that was valued at $1 billion a year by the courts, looking at the numbers. So you can just imagine what the value of that monopoly subsidy is, copyright protection for these companies. By Larry's estimation, and at minimum in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually, subsidy we give these companies in effect, maybe even more. So this system is not a free market system. And that's why when you hear the idea, this term that's used that absolutely makes my skin crawl, deregulation. Have you guys ever heard that term? Like the choice in media policy in our media system is regulation versus deregulation. Government bureaucrats nosing around, poking around versus freedom and liberty, deregulation. Who doesn't want to be deregulated? I don't want anyone regulating me. Deregulate me, please, of course. This media system has nothing to do with deregulation versus regulation. The question isn't whether someone's going to be regulated or not regulated. The question is always what sort of regulation you're going to have and whose interest is the regulation being done. We're told today, for example, that radio broadcasting has been deregulated. In 1996, when the ownership cap was lifted on radio, so a single company could possess as many monopoly licenses to radio stations as this country as they could afford to buy, and up to 8 in a single market. That was the Deregulation of radio. Well, test out the deregulation hypothesis if you want to kill some time some afternoon. Go out, locate a clear channel station in your community. It won't be hard. They own 1,400 stations. Locate one, start broadcasting on their frequency. Say, hey, it's deregulated. Now it's my turn. See what happens. Well, after the 20th year in Leavenworth, you'll say, gee, I guess it still is regulated. It's just not regulated for me. It's regulated for them. Deregulation in media means, whenever you see that term, substitute this expression, regulation purely to serve private corporate interests. If you always insert that in media debates where you see the term deregulation, you will understand what is almost always going on. The real debate here is over who the regulation will serve and how those regulations are going to be determined. It's unavoidable, and it always has been. As I said, from the very beginning of the Republic, Jefferson and Madison put enormous amounts of energy into the notion of a free press, how to build one, how to have one, because they understood the Republican experiment was unthinkable. Self-government was unthinkable without a viable press system. They had no idea that just letting wealthy individuals do what they wanted would be satisfactory. At every turn since then to this day, our media systems have been built on policies. And at crucial points, particularly when new technologies emerge, there have been policy debates, struggles, fights over how these policies could best be deployed to serve the people of this country. Going back to the telegraph, the post office before that, radio, films, television, satellite cable, through to the internet. The debates have sometimes been intense, as they were over the telegraph and they were with radio broadcasting. Sometimes they've been mild because they've been unknown to the general public and behind closed doors, as they were with television and satellite and cable. But they've always existed, and they're unavoidable in a society. There's no natural way to set up a media system. Even if one was a free market fanatic, even if one slept with a copy of The Wealth of Nations under their pillow every night, said, I believe in free market economics for media, you need aggressive government regulation to create a free market. It just doesn't happen naturally. It's impossible. It just doesn't happen naturally. Okay. Well, the problem we face today then, and this goes directly to what David was talking about, is if we know our system's built on policies, we know policies are the rate of policy debate, then if we have a bad system, or a system that's deeply flawed, as I argue it is in terms of journalism and content, if we have a bad system that's based on bad policies, then where do the policies come from? Probably some sort of bad debate. But looking at even if they're good policies in a good system, the policy debate's probably the capital good that produces the consumer good. It's the nucleus of the atom of a press system. You have to understand, how are those policies determined? In this country, we've had varying degrees of policy making, various calibers. The debate in the early republic was extraordinarily rich with public involvement on the postal subsidies. And the terms they were fought in were oftentimes clearly about democracy. The leaders of the movement to try to expand postal subsidies to make it easier to distribute newspapers were in fact the abolitionists, who understood their newspapers would be the first ones that would be shot down if they had to pay full amount for their postage. And they actually got free postage for weekly newspapers within counties by the 1840s as a result of abolitionist activity. But most of our debates in recent years have grown incredibly corrupt. They're done behind closed doors with absolutely no public involvement, and you get the media system we get, with a small number of firms owning a lot, lining their pockets and hiring PR firms to tell us they're giving us what we want. That's the system we have. The way I like to describe the media policy-making process in the United States, and I've done it a lot, and some of you have heard me speak before, familiar with this example, but it's absolutely the perfect example to describe media policy-making. It's appropriate that I bring this up in Los Angeles, or near Hollywood, because it goes to the 1974 film The Godfather 2, the Oscar-winning film. There's a classic scene in that film about halfway through in Havana, and Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone and all the American gangsters are assembled on a patio in Havana. And this is back when Batista's running Cuba, before the revolution. And they're dividing up Cuba amongst themselves. You know, like Frankie from Chicago, you get the casinos, Louis, you get the prostitutes. You know, the island's theirs. They own it. They get it. And just so we get the hint what's going on here, Hyman Roth, his 67th birthday, is carving up his birthday cake and giving a slice to each gangster as he tells them what they're getting. And the cake, of course, has Cuba on the outline. They're getting a slice of Cuba. And while Hyman Roth is doing this, he's saying, isn't it great to be in a country with a government that respects private enterprise? And that is exactly how media and communication policies have been done in this country for the most part for the last 50 years. Extraordinarily powerful lobbies, carving up a cake, getting all sorts of government goodies, monopoly licenses and privileges, benefiting from them richly, and then going out and saying this is free market, this is private enterprise, when it is the most corrupt crony capitalism imaginable, an affront to any notion of genuine free market capitalism. And understand that the analogy continues a bit further, because if you remember the movie Godfather 2, you know that Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone, they weren't in cahoots together. The movie was about their contest with the biggest slice of the cake, both in Havana or in Cuba and in the world, in the United States. And that's how it is with these guys who are carving up the cake, the telecom companies, the cable companies, the movie studios, the networks, the conglomerates. They're fighting each other for the largest slice of the cake. They have huge lobbying arsenals, I regret to say, not because of us, not because they're concerned about the general public, because they're fighting each other. That's why they have their nuclear warheads in terms of lobbyists. That's the major fight they have. But the one thing they all agree upon is it's their cake. No one else gets a slice. No one else gets to know about these debates. They aren't going to cover them. We're supposed to assume it's a natural system, and God meant for them to run it. And God meant for us to just shut up and shop. That's supposed to be the way the system works. And if you understand it that way, let me explain what this draws into David's talk. No area of policymaking has been more corrupt by any means than copyright and intellectual property. This process, the Hyman Roths and Michael Corleones, unabated except by an occasional librarian who might accidentally get into the outer chambers of the patio long enough to throw a pebble up with an eyesight of Michael Corleone, but have no effect whatsoever otherwise, has prevented our intellectual property laws from being distorted in the past 40 years, and you've, I'm sure, the details in the book. 11 extensions of copyright. They can now be traded, complete violation of the principle of which copyright's founded, traded as a commercial privilege. They've become a property right, instead of what they were meant to be and should be, a tax on knowledge. There's something, a necessary evil we should allow creators to give them incentive to create. But it's a temporary thing, and then it goes into the public domain where it's our common cultural heritage. It's obvious. That's what it's supposed to be. That's why it's in the Constitution. That's what it was for the first 120 years of the Republic. And it's been destroyed because of Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone, because of corrupt policymaking. Now, if you understand our policymaking that way, then you understand what the solution is. The solution is to energize people to be aware of these debates and to participate in them as informed participants. And the core principle, the more informed popular involvement there is, the more likely we are going to be to have policies that serve our interests, not just their interests. And I don't know exactly what those policies would be. I'm willing to take a chance and find out. I want to find out. I do know what they're going to be if we don't participate. We're seeing them. They're going to be policies that are going to suit Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone, not suit us. Now, a few years ago, if I gave this talk, in fact, until about 2.5 years ago, it would sound very hypothetical and theoretical. Oh, yeah, sure. You're going to challenge those guys who control the debate. They're the most powerful lobby in Washington. They're enormously strong. They own the politicians from both sides of the aisle. They control the news media, so how much press do you think you're getting on this one? It's hopeless. You know, what we do is we'll change the world on every other issue, and once we've solved every other issue, the bottom list finally will drag media up. We might have a prayer. You know, in 2812, we'll get the media. But it's a hopeless issue to organize around. That was the conventional wisdom. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, I understood the argument, and I've done enough historical research to show the power of this lobby. It was difficult to argue completely. But I also knew, from my own experience, the deep trouble so many Americans had with media, the deep concerns they had about media. And then when people understood the media systems were not a given, like the Rocky Mountain Range, that they couldn't affect, you know, but were something they could actually change, that these policies were made in their name but without their informed consent, that there would be a change, that there would be concern, there would be an uprising of sorts. And I think we've seen the beginning of that in the last 2 years. It is primarily launched by the media ownership fight in 2003 when the Federal Communications Commission announced it was going to review its core media ownership regulations with a clear eye to eliminating them altogether or certainly relaxing them. 3 of the 5 members of the FCC are Republicans. They are handpicked by industry. Michael Paul gets criticized oftentimes, the chair of the FCC, for being a stooge of industry. He's the best of the 3, just to give some sense of what we're talking about with the Republicans on the FCC. He's the most public service minded of the 3 Republicans on the FCC, in my opinion. We talk about politicians being in the pocket of industry. The Bush administration's in the underpants of industry. They're completely wed to the needs of these firms. So it looked hopeless. It looked like they were going to lose 3 votes on this issue no matter what happened. The three members said, we don't care what data comes up, we're going to vote to get rid of these rules. They said at the beginning. Before any hearings, they made their points clear. They were on scales to get rid of this. And it didn't look good, and Congress being controlled, both houses, by the Republicans, and Bush administration being completely gung-ho to advance the interests of their supporters in the corporate media community, had made it clear they were going to make sure the FCC went through with it. Yet we saw this uprising that stopped it across the political spectrum, because even conservatives, once you get off of Wall Street and outside of the Beltway, like the idea of having locally owned media. Like the idea of having news on local television. Remember, that's a crazy idea, news on local television. They used to happen. I know they say we have news today, but I'll tell you, I travel around the country, and the one thing I've found that unites all Americans, every American thinks their local TV news is the worst in the country. That's sort of like the one thing that unites our country today. Even conservatives don't like the idea of having their children's brains marinated in advertising. That's not a liberal or conservative idea. We found there was tremendous support across the political spectrum, and everyone is outraged at the corruption of this policymaking process. It's absolutely indefensible unless you're a shareholder in Clear Channel or Sinclair or one of these companies. It's absolutely indefensible. And it was like a prairie fire. Once people understand the system's a result of policies and it can be affected, it's like a switch went on. And suddenly everything changed. 3 million people contacted Congress, contacted the SEC over the course of 2003. We had several votes in Congress to overturn elements of what the SEC had done after they voted in June 2003 to relax the ownership rules. Finally, the courts threw it out. And now recently it looks like it will not be appealed to the Supreme Court. The industry might push it. But it's going to come back to Congress again and the FCC again later this year. And this year they're going to meet a welcoming committee. This year they will not be operating on that patio in Havana. This year they're going to meet hundreds of thousands, millions of people organized to work on it. And much of that work is going to be done by a group that I helped co-found called Free Press. I think a lot of you are familiar with it. We began just 2 years ago with one person, Josh Silver, who's hiding over there on the floor. Our executive director, Josh, had been the person who organized the campaign to get free elections what's the exact term of it in Arizona? Public funding for elections in Arizona, the successful campaign. And increasingly come to realize that every issue he was concerned about went through media. And as long as there was no journalism, no press coverage, he wasn't going to solve anything. And we had to fix the media problem in this country, make that a mandatory and high priority. Josh came to me and my friend John Nichols, who I've written with at length, said, let's start this group. 2 years ago, Josh was alone, sort of working on the side of someone else's office. Today we have 13 full-time organizers, a website, freepress.net. We have 3 people in our Washington office. This movement is exploding in a way that simply was unthinkable 2 years ago, because that light switch is going off. People are beginning to understand this is an issue we can change if we organize, something that was unthinkable 3 years ago in our culture. To give some sense of how far it's come, and I'll conclude on this, just in the last 3 months, MoveOn.org and True Majority, 2 groups that have large internet lists and memberships, in the millions combined for the 2 of them, did surveys of their members. What are the issues we should work on, put our most energy and resources in for the next few years after the Bush election, looking at the next 4 years? Of all the issues we talk about, war, environment, civil liberties, civil rights, right on us, what are the issues we should put our most energy in? And in each of their surveys, the second-ranked issue was media reform. Second, ahead of the war, ahead of the environment. I'm telling you, 5 years ago, media wouldn't have made the top 10. It wouldn't have been on the list 10 years ago. It wouldn't have been thinkable. What's media? What's that? What show we're going to watch? We've come a long way. We have a very long way to go, though. And I think for those of you who are students and researchers, understand there is a central role for scholarship here. And I don't mean partisan polemics. I mean hard scholarship, real data, real analysis, real historical research to help inform policymakers, help citizens, draw them into these debates to be meaningful participants. The exciting thing here is that it's wide open. We're in what I think historically we would call a window of opportunity now to change things in a way that hasn't been the case in our lifetimes, brought on by the collapse of the current regime on one hand and the new technologies and the policy issues that have emerged with these technologies that are unavoidable. Copyright, digital rights management, spectrum, ownership, access, on and on. And they're all going to be settled, most of them, in core ways in the next 3, 5, 10 years in the United States and globally. And it's in our hands what's going to happen there. So let's all work together on it. Thank you.
Why don't you 2 field your own, but questions, the floor is open. You can even make short speeches.
This is not exactly a question, but it's a quick comment, which was that I was at a retreat a week and a half or so ago put on by the SEIU, and it was to bring together Move On and Hip Hop Summit and all the Rock the Vote, and all the young people say, where do we go from here? And at one point I suggested that the 3 linked issues that would make more difference than any were campaign finance, media, and elections. And there was pretty sound agreement that those 3 together, which have all showed movement in the last few years, are the ones that really are the leverage points for just about everything else anyone at that table cared about.
Yeah, I agree. Do I need this?
No.
No? Okay. I agree. I will say this about campaign finance, and Josh and I talk a lot about this. We're seeing a lot of people in campaign finance moving over to media in the last few years because campaign finance has become hopeless. In the short term, the reason why it's hopeless isn't that it's not a great issue. It's more important than ever. But no one talks about it anymore. The last election by far was the most money-drenched election ever, but we heard a lot less talk about it since then than we did in 2002, 2019. People have given up. And the reason why they've given up, and only in the short term, is that in campaign finance, unless you win everything, unless you get fully publicly funded elections with no air, no holes, you can't win. You have all your chips are on one number. So if you leave the slightest crack, they're going to drive $1 billion truck through it at 100 miles an hour and destroy whatever the spirit and logic of your reform is. Look what happened with Mcchesney. It happens every time. And I think that what a lot of people, and Josh can speak for himself maybe if he wants to on this, have discovered with campaign finance is that when you try to do any campaign finance in Washington, you find out the #1 lobby, you know who you're fighting? The media. They are the campaign finance with the NRA is to gun control. Where does all that money go? It goes to about 6 or 7 companies that own all the TV stations. All that money goes there. The same companies that collect literally billions of dollars to run asinine political ads, then do absolutely no local journalism covering candidates, as we know. Here at USC better than anywhere else. It's an absolute scandal. So we organize around campaign finance through organizing around media issues.
Are you seeing very many TV license challenges in this current way? I mean, the Telecommunications Act has just opened this window for a little while, and it'll slam shut again.
That's a great question. And, the licenses that broadcasters get, believe it or not, they didn't inherit those. Those weren't ceded to them by Jesus or anything. They theoretically get those, and they don't pay for them. Unlike, they get those 3 years, 1 times 3 now, 7 or 8 year licenses for free, unlike cell phone companies that pay for them, because theoretically they aren't really commercial concerns. They're doing something in the public interest. That's the justification. They're not having to pay for their chunk of spectrum, unlike other users of spectrum. It's a farce, of course. It's never worked that way, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse, largely because for that system to work, you've got to withdraw licenses periodically. You've got to say, okay, you blew it. And Larry, you know better than you've challenged licenses in Philadelphia. You've got to basically go to the SEC and say, this is their record. They have not served the community like the law says they're supposed to. Take their license. There's lots of other people who can give it to one of them. You do that a few times, and then you're going to start seeing some reaction. Since that's never been the case in the United States, broadcasters don't hear us, they don't have to do anything. I think it's in Free Press, we're working to make it possible to raise hell on these sorts of issues, that license challenges. It's a great way for communities to come together, talk about what they want from their local media, and really get to know each other and start working together on these issues. Larry, you want to say a word on that?
Yeah, the only comment I make about license challenges is that although you don't win, the only one I know that won was Jackson. Maybe one other one.
That one in the courts, though.
Yeah, and that was on employment, not on content. I mean, it's not an issue. But it costs them a lot of money.
An interesting contradiction that we run into in our work is this tension between a deep desire to work in reforming the media culture and policy culture we live in, and the necessity for artists to actually be able to participate in the commercial exploitation of their work in order to be able to continue being artists. And so there's a big debate going on within the artistic community about the value of trademark and copyright. And that tension is extremely difficult to work through. I'd like to hear your comments on that relationship.
I think that for the most part, musicians and many other artists are caught between the middle. They're pawns in a larger battle. But I also think that there is a divided soul among artists. Yes. Pete Seeger had a small conference in November of folk people, folk singers, performers, and so forth, called Music, the Public Domain, and the Cultural Commons. And there's a surprising number of people whose very livelihoods as folk performers, which of course is dependent upon the legacy of the past and the community of people who pass around songs, wanting to be strictly property controllers of their work. And I think that's an inherent tension, at least in the current system. I think we're in an interregnum where we're going to have to develop new market structures whereby artists can more directly control and benefit from their artistic creation, because right now that's just not possible. And they just don't have the market power. And so I think that I empathize, and I think it's a poignant dilemma that artists face, but I don't see an easy solution until new market structures, at least particularly in music right now, are developed.
Yeah.
David?
Yes, John.
I just say that we have to go back to Bob's monopoly rents issue here, because if you really look at the structure from the artist's point of view, in the music business, for instance, if the artist is lucky to get 7 to 8% of
Yes,
the retail
right.
selling price of what is sold, and the people who are extracting the monopoly rents for controlling the 3 record companies that still exist in the world, that's the tension. And artists have to understand that as long as they continually give in to that system, most of the value will be carved off the top by the guys that control the monopoly rents. And then when we get into the network neutrality issue of whether 4 big broadband providers in the world will carve a huge amount for selling dumb pipe, will be another issue, and the artists will get even less. So that's where the battle is going to be fought.
There are a number of people talking about alternative compensation systems in the last few years, usually centered around some form of blanket licensing. Can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that things are in great flux, and there's probably people more knowledgeable than I, like Jonathan, who can talk about that. I mean, I think that it's imperative we develop bypasses that more directly benefit the creator, and that's the chief problem. And it helps to understand that you contract away your copyright rights to have access to the market. So in some ways, this is not an intellectual property issue, it's a contractual market power issue. So, and in which copyright is simply the facilitating vehicle. So, and I've heard of, there's many experiments going on about what's the best way for artists to reclaim the power that ought to belong to them. More power to them, but I can't talk specifically about them individual proposals. Maybe you can?
Well, not really. I mean, being a professor, I'll talk about it. I'd love to hear you. Actually, there are a range of things that are good, but I'll say one very winnable reform we can get, that we can win even now if we organize, I think, but not this be an easy fight, is simply what Larry Lessig has called for, which is that at a certain period of time, after 14 or 28 years, copyright automatically goes in the public domain unless the holder pays $1 to keep it. So that at least that 99% of stuff that is of no commercial value automatically goes in the public domain, so we don't have to hire lawyers to put together compilations of books with articles that are out of print. I mean, this is simply absurd on the face. I mean, that would be a nice start, something as elementary and as simple as that. But I do think the point you're getting at, and the point this all gets to, is the incompatibility of this entire digital technology with the traditional economic models of it. I mean, this is really, we've got to come up with a new system. The problem we face is the new system is going to come up with Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone. We know what sort of system it's going to be. It's going to be a system we're paying a lot more money than we should to a smaller group of people. The workers are going to get screwed over. The public's going to get screwed over. And the technology will help us to some extent, but it's not omnipotent. It doesn't have superpowers. You know, it's not kryptonite going onto that patio in Havana. I think there are we've done very little thinking about this. A handful of people have, but how do we restructure our industries? I know there have been a few books, but I think it's something we have to think sort of like real utopias. We've got to really come up with coherent plans. One economist I like, named Dean Baker, some of you might be familiar with Dean, he wrote a book with Mark Weissbrod about Social Security a couple of years ago. Works in a think tank in Washington. He came up with an idea. Granted, he came up with it before George W. Bush ran up these deficits. He came up with it in the late 90s when we had surpluses to the federal budget. He said, why not in the new digital era, the key thing we ought to do is that every American take $100 or $200 off of their taxes and divert it to any nonprofit medium of their choice. So it'd be a massive public subsidy, but not controlled by the government, controlled by individuals. You can send, it'd be a tax credit, not a deduction. So it's like either pay the government or you pay to any IRS-recognized nonprofit medium. So it'd be a huge way. Let's say in a community you wanted a local newspaper, you get 200 of your neighbors chip in, you get enough money to hire someone, put up a website, with reporters have the resources to actually cover your neighborhood, something like that. And the genius part of it, and the part I think you'd like, David, is the catch is that anything produced with this money automatically goes in the public domain. No copyright protections. It's a public sector to build out the public domain. You want to keep it the copyright game, just don't accept the money. That's your privilege. But it's a way we can build up, take advantage of this technology. So instead of putting barbed wire all over cyberspace, blast it up and pay at the front end, then make it free, rather than try to pay at the back end and put these fences everywhere. I'm not saying that's the solution, but that's the sort of thinking we need. That's the sort of policy making we've got to start conceiving, developing, debating, and working toward.
I'm curious, what do you think was the trigger that created that mass movement on media ownership? And second question for David, what would be the equivalent one we need for copyright?
Well, they're together. Copyright will only win. We're only going to win victories there in any of these. And the people who care about commercialism to children, local media, media ownership, public broadcasting, campaign finance, all those ones, we draw them together and we marshal all of them on all these issues. That's the only way we'll win.
And actually, I see this very near convergence with static electricity between them of the traditional media reform movement, the intellectual property component of it, and what I call the participatory media, the blog world, and these new genres of bottom-up, where it's sort of a proactive, non-policy solution. And I think that they all have a lot to say to each other, and that will be a political critical mass once those hydraulics get arranged. Because if you can amass kind of blogging firepower to help create new culturally authentic media, because I think there's a widespread perception that a lot of the top-down media are culturally sterile, not interesting or satisfying or intelligent. So I think that there's a real rich moment that we're approaching, but there's a lot of work, creative work to be done.
I agree. To answer your first question about what the spark was, I've been asked that a lot, and I think the one thing I've talked about is just that the key change is when people realized it was a political issue. It wasn't a given. That sort of opened the floodgates. What made that happen, though? Why do people understand that, or why do some people begin to understand it? At least a few million. It's hard to say. I'm not sure exactly. I do know that there's one thing that was crucial, I think, that year to the success that the movement enjoyed was having those two members of the FCC who were supporters, especially cops. You can't exaggerate how important it is that someone in the FCC says these guys are important, what they're saying should be taken seriously, and then is willing to go around the country to places like here and hold public hearings and let over 1,000 people in certain instances like Seattle come and give testimony. And what it does is it's that we have a chance to talk about this. It really built the basis of this movement in the grassroots of these public hearings he held in 2003. And we've held them. Free Press has organized several for cops in Adelstein since then. And what it did also for cops in Adelstein is once they came out and heard people talk about media and their concern about localism, commercialism, journalism in their communities, they went back to Washington and their backbones were wrought iron tough. They were, if they had done those hearings, they probably could have been snowed under with 82 4-martini shrimp cocktail lunches.
Let me ask the last question, which is, both of you have talked predominantly about the United States. Will you globalize it a bit and talk about how bad is the extension of copyright and trademark globally? Because obviously these companies are trying to do that. And do you see any best practices outside the United States that we might take, or is it the same thing everywhere?
Oh, it's not the same thing everywhere, but it's the same issues everywhere. I think what I would say about the global, we at Free Press, we would love to actually have a lot of our work be on global if we had the resources. Because right now the policy issues, so many of them are at the global level that can affect us. And no matter what we do in the U.S., if we're not cognizant of that and participating in that, we're going to be screwed. I think one of the things we see at Free Press do, and I like the entirety of the domestic media activist movement to do, we've got an important job. Right now, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the World Trade Organization, is considering a proposal probably about, you might know it, maybe 8 other people on Earth know about it, It's just developing right now. It's not been formally proposed yet. To include audio-visual under World Trade Organization statutes, which would make it much more difficult to have ownership limits in any country. It basically undercut the ability of any national power to have any sort of regulation over media. Audio-visual really encompass everything. Now, the U.S. government acts in these deliberations as the sworn agent of the big media companies. Republican or Democrat, doesn't matter. That's how it works. We have to open up a domestic front in the United States that says the workers, the media workers of this country, the citizens, the scholars, this is not the case. The interest of Disney and Time Warner and General Electric are not the interest of the people of this country. We don't stand this. We have to open up that domestic front, and we have to participate in these debates. In fact, we sent the legendary, I won't even admit, it's too absurd. Free Press actually sent someone to UNESCO last week to participate in these debates and discussions, offering that perspective. And we make it a point to participate to the extent we can. We don't have the resources, but I mean, the global side, intellectual property, the exact same. It has to be done.
Historically, the international arena has been used as a backdoor to basically get what they want without having to go through the American polity. And so that's been really pernicious, and I think the public interest has been underrepresented. But what's really interesting is that developing countries are starting to get their act together. And there's, at the World Intellectual Property Organization, Argentina and Brazil successfully got them to entertain a debate on a development agenda, which would be beneficial to developing countries. So in some ways, if the developing countries can get organized, we can do our own backdoor influence on U.S. policy by organizing them to confront U.S. media interests. And I think that a lot of that is happening.
But one thing we want to do, just so on the home front, because I know I'm being shooed here. Okay, then I'm not being shooed. One thing I want to do on the home front is that we would like to have it so any trade deal that's considered by Congress that includes something to do with media has to be voted on separately. It can't be snuck into a bill where it doesn't get a genuine debate. And that we have people, we're marshaling people on the Hill now, and we're going to be talking to you about that too, to make sure that happens. Because we don't think this sort of stuff can survive if it's out in the open. None of this stuff can. That's why they always try to do it in private and keep it behind closed doors and say it's for experts, like Michael Powell.
With that, I want to thank you all.